I set a single cupcake on the counter and pressed a match to its tiny wick. The flame flickered, then leaned sideways in the quiet kitchen. No voices, no footsteps, no phone call to interrupt the silence. Just me, a candle, and the hum of the refrigerator. My brother's birthday had filled a banquet hall last week with laughter and champagne fountains. Mine was a whisper in an empty room. Since when did I stop being someone worth gathering for the candle kept burning though untouched? I grew up watching a house bend toward my brother as if gravity belonged to him. He was younger, louder, easier to love in my parents' eyes. Every birthday, the yard filled with balloons that tangled in the branches and clowns whose painted smiles terrified me. For him, there were ponies to ride, inflatable castles to jump in, cameras flashing while my parents clapped. I stood at the edges holding paper plates, learning early that applause had only one direction in our family. When my birthday came, it was different. Sometimes a half-melted cake from the discount aisle, sometimes just a "we'll celebrate later." Later never arrived. I would smile, fold the hurt into silence, and watch my brother tear open gifts that cost more than my entire year of clothes. The differences deepened as we grew older. My 16th birthday passed with $20 pressed into my palm and the words, "Buy yourself something nice." That same year, a used car sat in the driveway with a red bow, his car, his freedom, his celebration. I drove myself to work shifts at the diner and saved tips in a coffee jar, while he drove past me in that car, music shaking the windows. My parents said I was the responsible one, the strong one. Responsibility meant covering bills when my father lost hours, handing over my paychecks from cleaning motel rooms, even when my bones ached. I nearly collapsed one summer dizzy from exhaustion carrying trays for 12 hours straight so the rent could be paid. When I fainted in the kitchen at work, the manager poured water on my face and told me to go home. But home wasn't rest. It was my mother holding out her hand for my envelope of tips before I'd even sat down. Once when money was tight, my uncle half-joked about arranging a marriage for me with an older man who would pay well. My parents laughed nervously, but they didn't say no. They didn't defend me. I remember sitting there, cheeks burning, realizing my body was just another potential sacrifice to keep my brother's life comfortable. And what did he do with the comfort? He coasted. College tuition paid bills, covered celebrations endless. When he stumbled, they excused him. When I succeeded, they nodded politely and moved on. I learned to sew up my own wounds quietly, while he was praised for simply existing. The memory that haunts me most is his 21st birthday. The restaurant glittered with lights, champagne bottles cracking open, waiters rushing between tables. Relatives toasted him as though he had conquered the world. I stood in the corner, a shadow at my own family's gathering. No glass was raised for me. None ever had been. I left early, walking under the buzzing streetlights, and whispered to myself, what kind of daughter have I been that my worth is only measured by what I can give away? Adulthood arrived without the magic I had once imagined. I thought turning 18 meant freedom, choices, and maybe finally respect. Instead, it meant longer shifts, heavier bills, and a silence from my family that grew heavier each year. I enrolled in college with scholarships I fought tooth and nail to earn. Nights I stocked shelves at a grocery store where the fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped insects. My hands cracked from cold cardboard, my back ached, but I told myself it was worth it. I believed that when I graduated, my parents would see me differently, no longer the girl who had to hand over her tips, but a woman who had built something from nothing. That spring, while I studied in a library cubicle with empty coffee cups stacked beside my notebooks, my parents mailed my brother a care package at his college across the state. Inside were homemade cookies, a crisp new jacket, and gift cards. I didn't even get a phone call that week. When I finally mustered the courage to ask why, my mother said, "He's the baby. He needs more support." I nodded, swallowing the taste of disappointment that had grown familiar. After graduation, I landed a modest office job. The paycheck was steady, and for the first time, I dared to hope my birthdays might change. That year, I invited my parents to dinner at a small Italian restaurant near my apartment. I saved for weeks to cover the bill, rehearsed what I might say if they asked about my new position. They arrived late, distracted, already talking about my brother's recent promotion. Through the entire meal, they didn't ask me a single question about my life. When the waiter brought out a slice of cheesecake with a candle, I realized I had arranged my own celebration. I blew out the flame, my wish caught in my throat. Years blurred into a cycle of work and quiet hopes. I helped with my brother's wedding, sewed decorations, stayed up nights making favors, drove across state lines to deliver them. On the day itself, my name was barely mentioned. They toasted him, praised my parents for raising such a fine son, and spoke of his bright future. I stood with a smile fixed on my face, wondering if anyone remembered that my birthday had passed just a week earlier unnoticed again. It wasn't just about parties. It was about being invisible in plain sight. I bought my own car, paid my own rent, climbed the slow rungs of a career ladder. My brother stumbled in and out of jobs, but each stumble was cushioned by my parents' savings, their forgiveness, their applause for his resilience. I carried myself quietly like a worker, ant steady but unseen. One winter, I ended up in the hospital with pneumonia. Days of fever blurred into the sterile white of the ward. When I checked my phone, there were no messages from my parents. But on social media, I saw photos of them celebrating my brother's promotion, streamers in the background, a cake tall with frosting. I closed the screen, my chest burning not only from infection, but from the truth in their eyes. I was expendable. I told myself I didn't need recognition, that independence was enough. But deep down, I longed for a single moment when someone in that family would look at me and say, "We are proud of you. You matter." That moment never came, and each missed birthday became proof carved deeper into me like rings in a tree trunk, recording years of drought. The older I grew, the harder it became to pretend I didn't notice the pattern. My brother's life sparkled with centerpieces and champagne flutes, while mine unfolded quietly, the applause missing. By my 40s, I had long stopped expecting balloons or cards, but there was always that faint ache when the calendar turned to my day, and nothing arrived but bills in the mailbox. What deepened the wound wasn't just neglect, but the scale of the celebrations they staged for him. When he turned 35, my parents rented out a banquet hall. The chandeliers glittered above round tables dressed in white linen. There was a chocolate fountain, a string quartet, and a guest list that stretched beyond family, old neighbors, co-workers, distant cousins. I watched the photos surface online, each one glowing with warmth. My brother stood in the center, cutting into a 3-tiered cake while my parents beamed beside him. Not once did it occur to them that just 2 weeks earlier, I had spent my own birthday eating Chinese takeout alone, the carton balanced on my knees while I watched reruns. They told me later they hadn't forgotten, they had just been too busy planning his party. "We'll celebrate you next weekend," my mother promised on the phone. The weekend came and went, as silent as the last. The following year was worse. They scheduled his celebration directly on my birthday. "It's easier for everyone," my father explained, as though logistics mattered more than acknowledgement. I stood in a crowded backyard filled with rented tents and sparkling lights, people cheering for my brother, while the quiet knowledge pulsed inside me. This was supposed to be my day too, but no one even said my name. Not once. I slipped away early, walking to my car under the strings of bulbs, feeling like a ghost drifting through someone else's joy. I told myself it didn't matter. I buried myself in work, climbing slowly into a management role. My days stretched long, spreadsheets, meetings, deadlines, but there was dignity in the paycheck, in paying every bill on time with no help from anyone. My brother still called my parents for money, still leaned on their savings when his ventures collapsed. They bailed him out every time. Meanwhile, I carried myself quietly, never asking, never burdening them. It was as if my competence erased me further. Because I survived on my own, they felt no need to see me. The loneliness pressed harder during family gatherings. Thanksgiving dinners turned into showcases of his new car, his children's accomplishments, his promotions, real or exaggerated. I often brought pies or salads I had prepared late at night after work, only to have them pushed aside in favor of the elaborate dishes catered for him. When I spoke, conversations drifted back to his stories. When I mentioned my own job, my parents nodded absent-mindedly, their eyes sliding back to him as if pulled by an invisible thread. One summer after another overlooked birthday, I tried to speak up. I sat across from my mother in her kitchen, the smell of coffee thick in the air, and asked why it had always been this way. She sighed as though the question was inconvenient. "He's fragile," she said softly, "and you're strong. You don't need as much." Those words sank into me like stones. Strong meant invisible. Strong meant unworthy of care. The ache followed me home that night into the silence of my apartment. I looked at the small cake I had bought myself and couldn't even bring myself to cut it. I left it on the counter until it went stale, as if its uneaten state mirrored everything inside me. As the years blurred forward, my health began to feel the weight of stress. Sleepless nights, headaches that pulsed behind my eyes, a sense that my body was carrying burdens too long ignored. I once ended up in the emergency room after fainting at work, and as I lay under the harsh lights, I wondered if my phone would finally ring with a message of concern. It never did. My parents were busy planning another one of my brother's barbecues. I began to avoid family events, inventing excuses, yet guilt gnawed at me. Part of me still longed for belonging, even when I knew it was a losing game. Each time I considered skipping, I imagined being branded the bitter sister, the cold daughter. So I kept showing up, offering quiet smiles, setting tables, clearing plates, while no one lit a candle for me. By the time I reached my late 40s, the pain had shifted into something sharper: anger, threaded with grief. I replayed memories late at night, lying awake in my bed, asking questions that had no answers. What had I done wrong? Was there something about me that made me unlovable, forgettable, easy to ignore? Had I been too quiet, too independent, too unlike the son they adored? The breaking point came the year I turned 50. My brother's 40th was planned for weeks, an elaborate lakefront party complete with live music, a rented dance floor, even fireworks. Invitations went out, photos circulated of the preparations. My birthday arrived 2 weeks before his, and the day passed without a single phone call. I sat at my desk at work, the office nearly empty, scrolling through messages from colleagues about deadlines, and realized no one in my family had remembered. That night, as I blew out a candle stuck in a muffin I had bought from the corner bakery, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just disappointment anymore, it was clarity. The years of waiting, hoping, excusing, had built a tower of silence inside me. I saw it for what it was. I would never matter to them the way I deserved. Their eyes would always turn toward my brother, their applause always reserved for him. And for the first time, instead of shrinking from that truth, I let it settle into me like cold air clearing the fog. I understood that I had two choices: to keep aching for recognition that would never come, or to create it for myself. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment, city lights blinking in the distance, and I whispered the words I had never dared to speak. I am done waiting. The silence after those words was not empty. It was full of possibility. For the first time, the absence of their voices felt like space I could fill with my own. Work had always been my refuge. If my family could not see me, at least my colleagues could. The office wasn't glamorous: rows of gray cubicles, the hum of printers, stale coffee that lingered long after the pot was emptied, but it was a place where effort mattered. The quiet persistence that had once been used to hold my family together found a new home in my career. I became the one people relied on to finish projects, to untangle crises, to keep promises. Over the years, I climbed slowly from assistant to manager. Nothing about it was easy, but each step felt like a small declaration: I can build something of my own. That winter, the company announced unexpected bonuses. It had been a profitable year, and for once the recognition was tangible. The check they handed me was larger than anything I had ever held. I sat at my desk after the meeting, the envelope warm in my hands, and felt something stir inside me that I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that long nights and sacrifices had weight. Proof that my presence wasn't invisible here. On my lunch break, I drove to the outskirts of town where the city gave way to winding roads lined with pine. I had seen a listing weeks earlier, a modest lake house tucked among the trees. It wasn't grand, but it had a porch that faced the water and windows that caught the light. I parked on the shoulder and walked down the gravel drive. The air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke. When I reached the porch, I gripped the railing and let myself imagine coffee in the morning sunsets, in silence birthdays, where the only candle I needed was one I lit myself. I called the realtor the next day. The process moved quickly, as if the universe had been waiting for me to step forward. Paperwork, signed, keys pressed into my palm. I drove back to that house and stood inside the empty rooms. The walls echoed, but the echo didn't feel lonely. It felt like possibility. For once, the celebration was mine, not borrowed, not delayed, not erased. I thought of every year I had handed over my paychecks, every time I had worked until my body trembled, every moment I had been told I was strong enough to go without. And now here was proof that I hadn't disappeared. I had built this. I had earned this. On the night of my birthday, I carried a single candle to the lake house, set it on the kitchen counter, and lit it. The flame wavered, reflected in the bare window. I whispered to myself, "Happy birthday," and for the first time, the words landed where they belonged. The day I moved into the lake house, the air was crisp, touched with the scent of pine and the faint sweetness of wildflowers that edged the road. I carried boxes one by one through the doorway, setting them down on bare floors that still smelled of fresh paint. Each step echoed, but instead of loneliness, I felt a strange fullness, as if the house was breathing me in, claiming me as much as I claimed it. I decided to keep my celebration simple. No balloons, no noise, no crowds of people lifting glasses for someone else while I stood unnoticed. Just me, the water, and the silence I had longed for. That evening, I walked out onto the porch with a mug of coffee and watched the lake darken into velvet. Crickets stirred, fireflies blinked like faint stars, and the reflection of the moon rippled across the surface. I thought of every birthday, before ignored, overshadowed, and felt a quiet shift inside me. This was the first time the day truly belonged to me. I took a few photos, the front porch with its wide steps, the sold sign leaning awkwardly in the yard, and the view of the water at dusk. Nothing staged, nothing extravagant, just proof of a life I had chosen for myself. Later that night, I opened my phone and posted them with a single-line birthday gift. To myself. For a moment, nothing happened. The photos sat quietly on the screen, glowing in the darkened living room. I placed the phone face down on the table, lit a candle, and let the stillness wrap around me. It was the first birthday I hadn't spent waiting for anyone else to remember. By morning, the silence was gone. My phone buzzed until it skittered across the table. Text messages poured in, at first from coworkers who congratulated me, their words warm and genuine. "You deserve this. So proud of you, can't wait to see it." Their kindness made me smile, made the house feel even more like home. Then came the family. "Why didn't you tell us you were buying a house?" my mother's text read. "We should have been part of this decision." My father chimed in. "This is reckless. A house like that isn't practical. What about maintenance? What about expenses?" My brother's message arrived last, a curt, sharp line that stung more than the others. "So you're flaunting money now? Some of us have families to support. You could have helped instead of wasting it on yourself." Calls followed, my mother's voice rising with indignation, my father demanding explanations, my brother's wife asking why I hadn't thought of the children who might have enjoyed weekends at the lake. Their words tangled together, outrage feeding outrage, until I could barely hear myself think. I sat on the porch with the phone in my lap, watching the water ripple against the shore. The accusations kept flashing across the screen, selfish, secretive, irresponsible. I let them pile up like unopened letters, each one heavier than the last. But beneath their weight, something inside me stayed steady. I hadn't bought the lake house to prove anything to them. I had bought it because I was tired of waiting for permission to exist. When I finally answered, I didn't explain, didn't defend. My message was short. It was my birthday. I wanted something for myself. The silence that followed was almost satisfying. For once, I had not offered excuses or apologies. I placed the phone face down again, stood and walked to the edge of the dock. The boards creaked under my feet, the night air cool against my skin. The water stretched out before me, calm and certain, and I felt the same certainty inside myself. They could rage, they could disapprove, they could twist my choice into selfishness. But the truth remained, this house, this moment, this birthday, it was mine. And for the first time, I did not need their applause. The echo of my own quiet was enough. The storm did not pass quickly. If anything, it gathered force. In the days after I posted the photos of the lake house, my phone became a battlefield. Calls at odd hours, messages that swung between guilt and anger, each one reminding me of the role I had always played, the giver, the reliable one, the shadow who made space for everyone else's light. "Why didn't you ask us first?" my mother demanded during one late-night call. Her voice cracked not with sadness, but with indignation. "A purchase like this, it should have been discussed as a family." I listened in silence, the phone pressed loosely to my ear. Family discussions had always meant their decisions, their celebrations, their choices. Mine had never warranted the same urgency. When I finally answered, my voice was even. It was my birthday. I wanted to celebrate it in my own way. There was a pause, followed by a sigh heavy with disapproval. "You've become selfish," she muttered before ending the call. The next morning, my brother showed up at my apartment unannounced. He strode inside as if he owned the air between the walls, tossing his car keys on the table with a metallic clatter. "So this is what you do with your money," he said, his eyes sharp, his mouth curled in disbelief. "Buy yourself a lake house while the rest of us worry about bills. Do you know how much help my kids could have used with their tuition? And you're out there taking selfies on a porch." I watched him pace the way he always did when the spotlight wasn't firmly on him. I thought of the years I had worked double shifts handing over my paychecks, so the light stayed on the years I had quietly gone without, so he could have more. "You've had help your whole life," I said softly. This time I wanted something for myself. He stopped pacing, turned to me, and let out a harsh laugh. "You're bitter. You've always been jealous. That's what this is." The words should have cut deep, but instead they floated past me powerless. For the first time I saw them for what they were, not truth, not clarity, but the only language he had ever known. Maybe I said my voice steady, but I'd rather be bitter and free than smiling and invisible. He stared at me, searching for a weakness, but I didn't look away. After a long silence, he grabbed his keys and left the door slamming hard enough to rattle the frame. That night, I drove to the lake house. The road curved through tall trees, the headlights catching glimpses of leaves trembling in the wind. When I arrived, the water lay still under a crescent moon. I stepped onto the dock, the boards cool beneath my feet, and breathed in the scent of pine and earth. My phone buzzed in my pocket, another message lighting up the screen. I turned it off and slipped it back, the silence around me louder than any argument. In that quiet, I remembered all the years I had lowered my voice, made myself smaller, swallowed questions that burned my throat. I remembered the birthdays I had let pass like shadows, the wishes I had folded into nothing. Standing there, the lake opening before me, I realized I had been waiting for their permission to matter, and I didn't need it anymore. The confrontation didn't end with a dramatic fight. It ended with me choosing silence over their noise, with me refusing to hand over the joy I had finally carved out. In the weeks that followed, their outrage dulled into muttering. My mother left voicemails laced with disappointment. My father sent clipped emails warning me about financial responsibility. My brother's wife hinted on social media that some people forget where they came from, but none of it pierced me the way it once would have. Each weekend, I drove to the lake house, filled its rooms with pieces of myself. A second-hand bookshelf I painted pale blue. Curtains that caught the morning light. A chipped mug I placed by the sink, the same mug I reached for each dawn. With every detail, the house became less an escape and more a declaration. I am here, I exist, I matter. The victory wasn't loud. It wasn't fireworks or applause. It was the simple act of waking up one morning, hearing the water lap gently against the shore, and realizing I no longer cared if my phone stayed silent. For once, silence felt like freedom. One evening, I lit a candle on the porch table. The flame flickered small but certain, just as it had on that forgotten cupcake years before. Only this time, it wasn't a symbol of absence. It was presence. Mine. I sat in the glow, sipping coffee from the chipped mug, and let the memory of every ignored birthday drift away like smoke. The anger was still there, faint around the edges, but it no longer consumed me. What replaced it was something steadier, something I had been denied all along: dignity. My family never apologized, never admitted the years of neglect. But I stopped waiting for those words. Their silence was no longer my cage. The house by the lake stood as my answer, each brick and beam a quiet defiance. The victory was not in changing them. The victory was in refusing to let them define me anymore. Life at the lake house unfolded in quiet, deliberate rhythms. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, the steam curling into cool air while the water mirrored the sky. Afternoons carried the sound of birds tucked in the trees. Evenings ended with the steady hush of waves against the shore. There was no fanfare, no applause, but I no longer needed any. Each year since I've lit a candle on my birthday, not on a forgotten cupcake, but on a table that overlooks the lake. I watch the flame glow steady against the glass, and I whisper a wish I finally believe in, that I never again wait for someone else to decide I am worthy. The anger softened, not because they apologized, but because I stopped living on their terms. I learned that healing doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from the quiet act of choosing yourself even when no one else ever has. I once thought love meant sacrifice, that strength meant silence. But here in this house I gave myself, I discovered another truth. Love can mean recognition. Strength can mean refusing to vanish. If you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever blown out candles no one cared to light, know this: you can choose yourself. You can light the flame anyway. And in that small act, you may find more freedom than you ever imagined. The lake house was never just wood and windows. It was a line drawn in the sand, a gift that said, I matter, even if no one else ever said it aloud. And every birthday since I've celebrated with no apologies, no explanations, just a quiet joy that finally feels like mine.